Welcome. My name is Diane,
And I'm Mel.
and we are the co-directors of Embrace Mercy and the head trainers at the Trauma Healing Resource Center.
So, what exactly is trauma? It's basically a situation in which you feel grave peril and feel completely overwhelmed by it. But you can't just look at an experience and say, oh, that's traumatic or that's not a big deal. It can't have caused trauma because it really varies from person to person, even if they have lived through the same experience. So, what's important is that sense of terror and that sense of feeling overwhelmed. We often talk about three different levels of trauma, each one compounding the effects of the previous one. So, the most basic kind of trauma is situational trauma, often referred to as PTSD. This could be an experience of violence, of surviving a natural disaster, even a car accident. The second level is complex trauma, and this involves a relationship with somebody that should be taking care of us, but instead is harming us. So think of intimate partner abuse, child abuse. In this case, we're not just occasionally triggered by this traumatic experience in the past, but it's like our alarm system is constantly on high alert inside our nervous system because of the chronic nature of it. Also, it really impacts a survivor's ability to trust others because of the relational nature. The third level is early childhood trauma, or sometimes it's called complex developmental trauma. This is complex trauma that happens during that really important developmental period of early childhood. And because it happens in early childhood, it literally impacts the developing brain of a child, the architecture of their brain, their developing nervous system, and therefore it's going to have a lot of consequences for all future learning, for attachment and forming meaningful connection with others, and for being able to regulate your emotions and your behavior. It also often means that a person's nervous system is just locked on high alert and they're constantly feeling unsafe and at the same time have fewer resources to deal with it. It's also really important to recognize the effects of neglect during this early childhood period. We think of trauma as associated with violence, but if you think about it, during early childhood, we're completely dependent on our caregiver for our very survival. And so when we experience neglect, it is life threatening, and therefore we feel that trauma and we have a lot of the same effects that you would from other kinds of trauma.
Thanks for that great breakdown, Mel. That was super helpful. Well, one of the first things that we focus on during our training is the idea that, contrary to what most people believe, trauma is not a memory. Healed trauma becomes memory, but active trauma lives in the present and in the body. So when someone who's suffering the effects of trauma is triggered, their body reacts to that trigger in the same way it did during the original trauma. It's happening in the here and the now and in their body. Therefore, healing needs to start in the body. And we also see how the effects of trauma, especially that early childhood complex developmental trauma, affects our health throughout our lifetime. Kaiser Permanente has done a longitudinal study where they identified ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. They took a large study group and they followed them over decades and looked at their health outcomes. And what they found was, as the ACEs increased, so did the negative effects on their health. For example, those who had 3 or more ACEs identified had a 60% increased risk of developing autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and diabetes 1. I agree with Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the leading trauma experts of our time, when he says that trauma and its effects is the #1 public health issue of our time.
We've witnessed this firsthand in our over 2 decades of working with survivors of all kinds of trauma. We were first introduced to the effects of trauma when we began working with kids in Romania who had been abandoned and were living in institutions. When we witnessed the global impacts that trauma was having in all their areas of development, we made the intentional decision to stay with this cohort of kids throughout the lifespan, even adopting 2 of them into our own families. And we actually continue to bring body focused healing practices to this group and are dedicated to long-term relationship with them, even as they are now young adults and even moving into middle adulthood. We've also dedicated ourselves to training others in these evidence-based practices that promote the most healing and resilience for trauma survivors. By practicing mindfulness, rhythmic attunement, trauma-sensitive yoga, sensory awareness, just to name a few activities, caregivers, survivors, and professionals can experience firsthand the power that somatic interventions can have in helping us reclaim our lives from the grips of trauma.
What we at the Trauma Healing Resource Center bring is hope for those who may not be clinicians but work with or provide care for those impacted by trauma, especially developmental trauma. There are so many ways we can help move survivors toward healing that don't require a specialized degree. Somatic or body-based understanding and techniques are available for all of us to utilize, and they can make a huge difference in a trauma survivor's journey to healing. And the impact of long-term relationship is vital. Judith Herman, often called the mother of trauma healing work, talks about how trauma brought on by relationship, and if you remember Mel's definition, relationship is a key part of what makes trauma complex, can only be healed through relationship. So we're so excited to have you partner with us as we bring these techniques and practices to audiences via the Trauma Healing Resource Center training portal. Thank you.